for being here. Stanford Center for South Asia and Art Forum SF welcome you to the 5th edition of the South Asian Literature and Arts Festival 2024, or SALA, as it's popularly known. I particularly enjoy saying that. Thank you for coming and being part of this festival. Before we begin, a big thank you to all our sponsors who have enabled us to bring this quality of festival to our Bay Area community. Oopsie, okay. Shuffling around, just a minute. So today's panel is, well, with the Booker Prize winner, Shehan Karunatilaka, in conversation with Dr. Sharika Thirangama. The keynote speaker is Shehan Karunatilaka. No surprises there. Just a few house rules before we begin our program. Please keep your cell phones on silent and no video recording, please. There will be a 15 minutes Q&A, depending on how entrenched this conversation is, plus or minus, after the discussion, and definitely a book signing by the author. His books are available for sale, so you can get his books, and there'll be a book signing by the author in the atrium afterwards. Please make sure to visit our art exhibition area above the BCC. So just as you go out here, up the stairs, we have a wonderful art exhibit, lots of local artists, so please make sure to visit. And vendors who are supporting the festival in the courtyard at the back here and in the front. A few housekeeping rules. Please make sure to keep the house clean. Essentially, if you've got a bottle of water, please pick it up after you when you leave. And I just want to say a few words about our moderator, Dr. Sharika Thirangama. Sharika Thirangama is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Stanford. Her research in Sri Lanka and in Kerala, well, her research I'm sorry, my grammar was wrong there. Her research is about Sri Lanka and in Kerala. Her 2011 book, In My Mother's House, Civil War in Sri Lanka, 2011, was on civil war, political violence, militancy, displacement, militarization, and intergenerational and gendered relations for Sri Lankan Tamil and Sri Lankan Muslim minorities. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome with your applause to both our panelists this afternoon. Thank you.
So welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to see a full room, and let me take the opportunity to introduce a little bit of a dark and Dravidian note here, Vanakkam. I think you guys need to hear some languages from the south every now and then.
Aibuan Vanakkam.
Komada. And it is my great delight. I'm going to give a very brief bio for Shehan because I want to launch us into the conversation. I know many of you have so many questions as well. So if you didn't already know, Shehan Karunatilaka is the 2022 Booker Prize winner for this novel, The Seven Moons of Maali, Almeida. He's also the author of my favorite cricket novel, The Chinaman, The Legend of Pradeep Mathew, which is the winner of the DSC Prize, the Commonwealth Prize, and the Gratian Prize. He also writes short stories. He writes screenplays. He plays in a band, writes lyrics. He's a man of many, many talents. And so I am really, really excited to be able to talk to you. And I think that what I want to do, if you don't mind, is also start because your book, for me, as a book, is about mourning. It's a very tender, loving, funny, and moving book about how we in Sri Lanka deal with our dead, and how many of them we have. And so let me just start by bringing some of our ghosts in. I don't even know where to start, but I'll start with my mother, Rajni Thiranagama, and her students, Shelvi, Manoharan, Anton, killed by the LTT, Sivaramani, who killed herself, my favorite uncle and journalist, Kuamuthi, killed by the state, George Ratnayaka, my father's family and teacher killed in his village by the JVP, all the Sinhalese killed by the JVP and the state, Dayapatirana, who also features in your book, my father's friend killed by the JVP. And that is just in these short years. But I would also like to remember all the people killed, disappeared, the men and women raped by the Indian army. I'd like to remember the Muslims killed on their knees in Kathankudi Mosque by the LTT. And of course, I don't want to forget, more recently, the thousands of Tamils killed at the end of the war in 2009 by the state, of which a very large proportion were Dalits and also those from Malayaha Tamil communities from the descendants of Indian plantation labor. And that is just some of the ghosts we have. And I bring that up because there are all of us who are, in fact, survivors of that. And it's a very Sri Lankan thing, isn't it? We have all of these ghosts. We think what to do. We carry on. We restart our lives again and again. And I think that your book speaks to that, but also it speaks to this moment because, of course, we are all watching Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, and now Lebanon being leveled and destroyed to a rubble, and all those lives lost by the Israeli army. So I think this is a book that speaks to that moment, but it also speaks to this world that we live in and how we approach the question of all our ghosts and what do we do with them. And the kind of profound violence that we all hear every time we turn on the news, and none of us know really what to do with that. And I found that reading your book really, in some ways, a very healing and humorous experience, a very Sri Lankan book. And I sort of want to start with that, really, because I think your books, both of them, Pradeep Mathew, Chinaman, and The Seven Moons, read at two levels. So for a Sri Lankan, there's a lot of very recognizable things. It's like being in a hall of mirrors where you're like, oh, I kind of know this person. There are places that you know. It's always this sense of being in a familiar room in some way or another, but from a new position. And for the non-Sri Lankans, I mean, your book has had an extraordinary success because it speaks, even if you don't know the figures, it speaks to something in people. And I wanted to maybe start, and I know you're always asked this question, but I do want to start with your choices in both of your books to choose real figures somewhat, and then play around with them, and this kind of mixture of speculation, fact, and fiction. And, why do you make that choice? And what does it allow you to do, in fact? And also, what are the things, I think it's very brave of you, actually. It is very, very, I think it's an incredibly courageous choice to make because, we Sri Lankans, we always like to think that we know better than others. Somebody writes about someone we know, no, but that's not the real story. So I actually think that you did this incredibly interesting thing that Sri Lankan fiction doesn't often do. So maybe you could just start by telling the audience, how do you choose?
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Well, firstly, it's wonderful to see that the book has traveled. You say brave. I think I didn't expect a story about a left-arm Chinaman bowler who played 2 test matches against Pakistan in '87 to travel all the way to Stanford. And so I think when you're writing, you do have that sort of arrogance that you think, okay, this book could be great. At least I want to read it. But you also have that realism that, it might go to India, but not beyond that. And so I think with the first one, I was also aware that, this was after the '96 World Cup. So in the midst of all, I'm sure we're going to talk about the Civil War and all the carnage, but in the midst of that, Sri Lanka won a World Cup. And for me, I thought as a first-time writer, I'm not equipped with the tools to unravel the Civil War, which was still ongoing, and we thought a forever war. So let me focus on cricket. And so there, mixing fact and fiction was a bit of the fun because the reader would almost think, did Pradeep Mathew exist? So there, I didn't do too much. I kind of kept it really on the ball, if pardon the pun. Like every single match was researched and down to the names. And I did silly things like mix up names. There's Aravinda Ranatunga and Tony Botham and all that stuff. But of course, the second book is a different, we're not talking about how so-and-so fixed the Asia Cup in 1988, though that gets... The irony is Sri Lankan, especially the drunk uncles that feature in that book, get much more passionate about the question of whether Muralidharan chucks or not, as opposed to human rights violations over the last 30 years.
He doesn't.
Yeah. Well, contentious, but, read the book. No, he doesn't. I can't be on stage saying Muralidharan. That, I couldn't go back there, but no. I wrote a movie about it, and he features in this, and so ongoing argument. But with this one, now the references are there for the Sri Lankan reader will be able to spot them. So the fact that Maali Almeida has a few things in common with Richard de Soisa and Dr. Rani, with your mother, Dr. Rajini Thiranagama, and Daya Pathirana. And for me, that was just I thought, okay, I'm going to write a ghost story, and in that, a Colombo-based activist murdered by the state, a Jaffna-based activist murdered by the LTT, and a young Marxist who, again, it's hazy, but was certainly one of the first victims of that second wave of Marxist insurrection. What would they have to say if they were in the afterlife? And the reason for that was, again, it's a long catalogue, and you just took us up to 2009. Past, and I think most of my books end at that point. 2010 to 2014 has been a roller coaster joyride, and we've had another chapter unfolding there. So whatever said about Sri Lanka, it is a beautiful country, but also plenty of material for dystopian novelists, plenty. But, okay, to answer your question, it is, with the first one, you're having a bit of fun. With this one, I was aware that even though there is humor, the jokes have to stop at some point. And every ghost in the book, it was originally called Chats with the Dead, is based on an unsolved murder of 1989. And I'm not a big academic or historian. You can just go as far as Wikipedia and assassinations in the Sri Lankan conflict, government killings, terrorist killings. It's all there, and the list is literally longer than your arm. And so I borrowed from that, but I think in Seven Moons, it's a lot more fictionalized, and you'd have to dig pretty well to see where they came from, apart from the three main ones, which we identified. But also, I don't know if it's bravery. I just didn't think we'd be dissecting it so far away. So I guess with the next book, I'll be a bit more careful. And maybe stay away from the corpses and the cricketers. These are the controversial topics. But
I don't want to. I'm trying very hard to talk about the book without giving any spoilers.
Yeah, no spoilers,
But in Chinaman, there is a Shehan Karunatilaka, right? Who plays music and who ends up with a name. And I find that I love that part. There's a very humorous part involved in Shehan Karunatilaka there. And I was thinking about it because yesterday on the Sri Lanka panel, Shyam Salvadorai says that he puts a little bit of something of himself in every character that he writes about. So I wondered, okay, so I think in the Chinaman we see a little bit of some parts of you maybe that are unrolling in there, right? Of course, and that's maybe more self-evident, the cricket, the guitars, the music, and so on. So did you do that with Seven Moons? Is there a Shehan Karunatilaka in Seven Moons? A little bit of you in any of the characters, in any of the places?
The first one, it was, again, with no spoilers given away. There's a bit of postmodern hijinks that happens in the third act, but also, this corny fantasy version of because I was as I've said on my website, a failed rock star. I played in a few bands and didn't really export further than Gall or Candy. But this fantasy guy who has one hit, that was, I didn't want to be John Lennon or Paul McCartney. I thought one hit and he lives off the royalties of that hit. It was just, and goes around solving mysteries. I thought, okay, that's the fantasy.
It's a dream.
It is, and I think it's, now I don't know, do you earn money off royalties when they're streaming? So I don't know, so maybe it was very much of that time. See, that's why I write historical fiction, it's even though it's just about yesterday. So so that character is there. In this one, I suppose what I could find commonality with was the Colombo bubble, which is where it's set, and overtly Maali talks about the Colombo bubble. And in that, we lived, if you track the serious beginning to 83, you can track it much earlier to 2009, we lived in Colombo, and it wasn't the front lines. It was a city of checkpoints and curfews, and you'd get assassinations, bomb blasts, and all of that. But for most of the part, it was the paper would come and there would be death count on the front page, cricket score on the back. And we'd turn to the cricket score and read about and distract ourselves in different ways and live in that bubble. And even quite recently, when we had the economic collapse and the whole country was on its knees, the recovery, if you went to Colombo in December of 2022, the lights were on during a power crisis. We had a floodlit cricket game happening, and the Colombo bubble seems to carry on regardless of what's happening. It's almost like the war's happening somewhere else. And I think that's some maybe guilt that I felt having lived through it, but not really having lived through it. And Maali Almeida is a character who was much braver than the rest of us. The rest of us just, sat back in Colombo, formed rock bands, watched cricket, tried to write novels. But Maali Almeida was someone who actually went into the front lines and took these photographs of things that people will later deny happened. And so maybe, again, it's a fantasy version of myself. Instead of staying back playing bass, I should have gone out there and done something. But of course, Maali Almeida also paid a high price for doing that. And so I think that's the thing I can track. There's a few cat jokes which I don't want to get into on a public forum, which may be autobiographical. But aside from that, that's what I would say, because also this was the late 80s, so I think it's a generation before, these were boomers. I was born in the 70s, so I guess I'm a Generation X, and we'd lived with the war for so long and indifferent to it. We'd go to the cricket score. What's the point in looking about the bomb blast on the bus? And that was our coping mechanism. But I think this generation of the 80s, Richard de Soysa and your mother, everyone who had a lot more idealism and were willing to put themselves on the line. And I think that was the difference. So I guess that's what I would track as autobiographical, if anything. But yeah, I do have a lot of affection for, let's call him Garfield Karunasena, who turns up later in the novel, and yeah.
So, I mean, let me ask you about something to do with Colombo, actually. So I agree that part of the book is a kind of sort of a pillaring of the Colombo set, but I also read both of your novels as a love story for the city Colombo. And it's a city that maybe you and I know that is a city that no longer exists in its current form. It's a shabby, genteel city, right, of the Colombo of the 80s and and the 90s and early 2000s, where you can go and get a hopper and a beer and single cigarette, or there's this thing where Garfield says, well, I hate Colombo, but I love the way it smells in a monsoon. And, and there are ways in which, in your books, there are always these references to places in the city, that anyone who's lived there at that time, that city. And whether it exists anymore, I don't know, because some of these places you can't get to because of the flyover, and you would have been able to experience the city in a different way. So do you see Colombo as your kind of literary city in an affectionate way? So I don't mean like the Colombo set, I mean the actual fabric of the urban, a kind of very particular city with a very particular language as well, because the language that you use in the Seven Moons really evokes a certain kind of Colombo vernacular to me that you also see in like Carl Muller's books, like The Jamfruit Tree and so on. There's a way of speaking, a way of being, a kind of Machan humor, if you will have
Machan
it.
humor. Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned Carl Muller. He wrote a book called Colombo, which mixed sort of short stories with historical essays. But Colombo now is actually much nicer than the Colombo in the books, I must say. You can have a hopper and a beer or an arak, and if you still smoke a cigarette anywhere. And also it's curious now because, so the time I was writing, it was war-torn and shabby, and it had this glory from the 50s, 60s, but also a point of many conflicts. But now, I mean, I think one thing I have to say, after the family dictatorship, the parks opened and the buildings opened up. So dictators are pretty good for gardening and landscaping in some cases. So people are saying send them to the war crimes tribunal. I think just let them garden, build up Badikal, Jaffna, Gaul. So the city, because before when I'd have friends from visiting Sri Lanka, I'd say, yeah, skip Colombo. Just go to Gaul, go to the East Coast, Kandy, everything, and don't bother with Colombo. But now I say, yeah, spend a day there because, and also now we're building this future city on the sea with, don't ask me whose money, but it's looking pretty impressive. It's literally this port city. And there are stories that find me also, and now, yeah, I said I'm done with the ghost stories, but recently, and it's people sending it to me or the algorithm, but building this port city, so a bit of context. I mean, again, after the end of the war, there were highways, there were a lot of Chinese money, but not just Chinese money. Money flowed in from everywhere, highways, airports with no planes, harbors, and there was a lot of harbors with no ships, but that could change. And there was all this sort of superficial progress with Colombo, and I think it took on. But I read an article that building this port city, they found unmarked graves. They found, and this, I would be all over this story if I was still writing that kind of book, but yeah, unmarked graves and question of do we identify them or not? And I think that is the central metaphor of the book is, do we bury the past or do we dig it up and scrutinize it? But back to your Colombo question, I think it's a fairly seedy side of now. In Chinaman, it's mainly Moratua Rakmalana, and it's the dive bars and the betting shops, but then you have these mansions, which again, no spoilers, but these kind of crooked characters, they get the nice Bawa houses and they're operating behind the scenes. So I was doing sort of the seedy underbelly of Colombo, but I think in 7 Moons, they finally, in the 3rd edition, put a map. And it's a map of almost where the bodies are buried. And I was asked to do a tour of Colombo for Der Spiegel. And you don't know me, but I'm the worst. My sense of direction is, it's a disability. So I was the worst tour guide. I couldn't go from Galle to Beira Lake, but in the end, we finally made it through there. And I realized the places where the bombs have gone off are now parks, and we don't have many memorials in that city, or very selective ones, and went to the so-called torture house, which I thought was fictional, but then, and I'm not going to tell you where it is because, I don't think it's operational now, but it is a very eerie building, and so Colombo has, and of course Hotel Leo, this, again, if you know Colombo, you can figure out where that was. So I don't know if I'm doing much for the tourist board of Sri Lanka, though I've worked on that side of the fence as well. I have done Air Lanka commercials and all of that. So I don't know, it wasn't consciously saying, oh, I live in this wonderful city, I want to immortalize it or anything, but yeah, it turns out to be not too bad. And I'd say, if you're coming to Sri Lanka, spend a day or 2 in Colombo. It's not bad. At least you can see where the bodies are buried. But they've made it look pretty. The parks are still operational. Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, that is also the kind of, that is a very Sri Lankan motif, right? We can laugh and we can also, these things are all in the same space, right? So just like the BMICH building is just in front of the police cells where lots of people were tortured in the 42nd floor, right? That's whenever I go past that, my father always says, that's where some of the keeping, and at the same time, my father will also take me to the barista because he really likes the fact that they have a barista now close to there that he can get his coffee.
Was
right?
it really the 42nd floor? 42 is everywhere. Okay, I wasn't. Right.
But but these are and maybe it's apocryphal stories. But the thing is that what you depict is that we all know in Sri Lanka many of these stories, all at the same time, and it's through these that we're keeping something alive, right? Precisely because the buildings are being built, things are being built over. There is very little to memorialize anything, right? There's no memorials to 1983. There will be no, there are memorials to the end of the war, but they're really ugly and they're for the soldiers. So is it just through stories? Isn't that what your book in some ways says, that the stories have to be kept alive because we are in fact, the infrastructure of it all.
and the amnesia, the collective amnesia. Also, because it's so action-packed, we move to the next catastrophe. So, forget going all the way back to 89. If you just look at the Easter attacks, which 2019, completely destabilized what was looking like a good governance government and a fresh way forward. And you can really track that event had political implications. And again, what's the narrative? I'm sure novels will come out about that, because there were conspiracy theories, there was a political impact, there were some arrests, and then in the end it just gets put away and filed away because we move on to the economic collapse and the getting rid of the president, and now the new and so it seems like, and you're right about this memorial. I've said this a few times, and I was pointed out that apparently President Chandrika Bandaranaike
She did apologize. She's the only one who has apologized.
Did apologize, yeah. So she apologized in 2003. Though, I mean, I guess she was in the opposition then, so it wasn't, she was, not taking risks. But it was still, at least that was something. But no memorial. The only memorial is a digital one. Every July, your feed suddenly gets the same 3 photographs and recycled articles, and at least that's an archive and we talk about it. But of course it also descends into the Sinhala savior story, which which was true, but then everyone pitches in with, yes, but my family, we sheltered the Tamil people and we did that, and then that dominates the narrative. But of course, for every Sinhala savior, there was many Sinhala demons, and those people haven't been prosecuted. And so that's really the seeds of Maali Almeida, who was there, because I wondered, did no one have cameras? Well, obviously not to the extent as today, but why were there not as many photographs? Not just that incident from the war. I know it was a lot more complicated back in the day, but this idea, this fantasy that maybe there is a photographer who has all these photographs, and that way we can keep these memories alive, because they do fade from memory when we don't have any visual sort of reminder of them.
And I think that, just to say, this is a sort of perennial theme also, right? This in Sri Lankan history. And in some ways, I thought it was very interesting that in Maali Almeida and also in the Chinaman, you have all this action happens. It's quite plot-driven, right? So somebody's always doing something. Something's always happening. Somebody's always hoping that something will work out or not work out. And so they drive to, they're very driven novels in many ways. But at the same time, you as an author also convey very well that sense that also nothing much changes. And sometimes, in fact, it goes all the way around. So there's a very funny reference in The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida to a young MP, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who, in his human rights days, raises a question about the mothers that disappeared, but of course then becomes, as we know from those reading, responsible for, most of, Sri Lanka's disappeared in the contemporary period. So there is this both forward momentum, but there's a sense of stasis and cycles also.
Yeah. Now that's an Easter egg for Sri Lankan readers, and it was very much there. So it seems I'm doomed to rewrite every book twice. The first book was called Chats with the Dead, was the Indian edition, and I spent COVID rewriting that. And a few things ended up on the cutting room floor, and that was one, the role of a young MP he was called Percy M. Rajapaksa, but who was in the opposition at the time and was protesting human rights violations that were happening. And then one of the characters says, let him run the country, let's see what happens. And say that idea that, and it's curious because now we're at a period we've elected a new government, and many people say that the good guys have now finally won and all that. And so we who've lived in that country for so long are like, okay, let's enjoy the honeymoon now, let's enjoy it now. But history has always, but I think that's a very Chinese way. I'm talking about all our different overlords that we have, even though we're not supposed to be colonized. We have many overlords from both sides. It's a very Chinese idea, the cyclical view of history, whereas I guess the West, I'm very simplifying. I can't believe I'm teaching history at Stanford now with my diagrams, but the Western idea is progress and progress and progress, whereas China 100 years ago it was wrecked with the opium wars, it was backward, but it had its time, and now its rise is coming again. But this idea of the rise and the fall, and we've seen it, the cyclical thing. If you follow Sri Lankan cricket, you've seen the cyclical thing in action. We're just on a high now, beat New Zealand twice. But so, yeah, there is that sense of, I think that's not something I plotted. I do plot them because I do think of them as detective stories, both of them. One is a missing persons detective story. Pradeep Mathew's missing, and you have these two bumbling old men. This is a murder mystery with suspects, except the corpse is the detective. That's the only slight innovation. But they follow those tropes of the murder mystery. And then I guess with this case, chatting with the dead, the ghosts tend to chat a lot and philosophize and make political statements, and that gets mistaken for literature. And that's why, but I at my heart, I'm still trying to write, because I think it's a very difficult thing to write not a formulaic, but a thriller that grips you, or murder mystery. So there is a lot of plotting, but yes, there is, again, with no spoilers, a sense that, one interesting thing someone asked me is, why are there no detectives if you're writing detective stories? And it's very true, they're journalists. In both of them, they're journalists. And there are detectives, there are cops there who are not sure, are we solving this murder or are we covering this up? And also it's a reality, if I had a detective, because in Sri Lankan crimes, be they murder or whatever, you don't have Sherlock Holmes coming in with his pipe and saying, okay, I think, or Poirot twirling his moustache. You don't. There's an investigation, there's a cover-up, someone says someone did it, and then that goes into a file. It's the journalists that go in there and unearth these files and end up paying with their lives in some cases. And so and that was not a conscious thing, but I think, I'm writing a detective story, but the heroes are the real heroes, which are the journalists, and the cops are just these bumbling, who knows? Maybe this is all going to change, or maybe this book is going to be an anachronism now that we have this.
It's interesting that you say that, because some of what your book really mirrors in the fact that Maali can't remember who killed him in the beginning, but of course through the book, no spoilers, it will come to light, is that, often in Sri Lanka we know who has killed people, but the proof is what people go and search for. Often it's not unknown broadly who has actually done it, so that it's known, but it's not known at the same time. And just as in your book, the question of how do we prove it, what is there to show that this happened, is often the real search in Sri Lanka itself. And I thought that your book really brought that out very well, because Maali himself also has to realize in the end who it is. And how do you, we've just had a very Sri Lankan conversation. I have another Sri Lankan question, but first of all, I want to ask, how do you find, we're here at a South Asia Literary Festival, so how do you see this work fitting or not fitting, or within this kind of larger idea of South Asian fiction? It's as a Sri Lankan, you're often, you are sometimes out of place in these sort of settings. So how are you going to be, do you see yourself being moved into a kind of canon of South Asian fiction, or how do you find speaking to a South Asian audience?
No, I think, look, we have, and I'm sure I can speak for the other Sri Lankan writers who are on my panel. We've been profoundly influenced by South Asian fiction. So the obvious examples are Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. It opened the doors for all of us. Simply, for many reasons, but also because if you read Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie, and you hear him speak, he doesn't sound like that. He sounds like a posh Englishman,
yes,
but yet he decided to use the masala language of Mumbai, and that gave us permission. We didn't have to sound like posh Englishmen when we wrote, because that was a losing battle. And Karl Muller is another one, less celebrated, who gave us that. But also, I was influenced very much by that golden age of Pakistani writing. So Muhammad Hanif's Exploding Mangoes, and Mohsin Hamid, and Kamila Shamsi, and Naqvi, again, talking about the Pakistani dystopia, but using very different and very authentic voices. And yeah, as someone who's even in Chinaman days, there's a lit fest in every village in South Asia, so I'm well traveled there. And I've seen more and more Sri Lankans become part of that conversation. And I think now Sri Lankan writing has, we're having a moment as well. If V.V. Ganeshanandan winning the Women's Prize and the Nebula Prize by Vajra Chandrasekhara. Again, very different tones and very different voices. So I don't see us as apart at all. And I think Sri Lankan cinema is now, taking cues from the region, from, not just Bollywood, but, the regional cinemas as well. So I think, and I see it mostly in hip-hop. Not in, I was an old Pink Floyd guy, and we're still playing Comfortably Numb to nobody. But the hip-hop guys and girls, I mean, it is quite less hairy men playing to other hairy men. But also the voice is something that really strikes me, because in hip-hop music, Tamil hip-hop, Sinhala hip-hop, they can rap in their own accents, use their own beats, use their rhythms, use their own slang, and it sounds so much more authentic. And I think that's a lesson. And I think, again, you see the region being influenced by each other. So, I don't think Sri Lanka is very much part of that shared culture. And we all like to eat dal with our hands. That's the thing that binds us, if nothing else. And so I very much feel part of that conversation. Yeah.
And so maybe I want to open it up for the audience. And sorry if this side of the room, I'm looking away, but to have a conversation, one has to look at. Yeah. But I wanted to maybe ask you the kind of, a question about this theme in your book, which I find really interesting, where you talk at a certain point about Kuweni and the curse, Kuweni's curse. There's a kind of mythic structure where you have the Nagas and then Vijay, and you just mention it there, but then you have this continuous kind of reference to Kuweni, and then there's a point where these leopards come up all the time, and there's a sense that, okay, well, actually these lions and tigers are in fact not native to Sri Lanka. We don't have any, but we do have these leopards. We use the pangolin and so on.
The pangolin,
but the leopard is a frequent feature, and I sort of thought that for me, and so you can correct me if you're wrong, I thought of it as maybe you trying to find a way to talk about Sri Lanka without a dominant ethno-nationalist language that is given to us often as Tamils, Muslim, Sinhalese, Burghers, that there are these frames which provide these origin myths in this very ethno-nationalist way, and we do have to narrate ourselves as Tamil or Sinhala. And I wondered whether with some of whether that's a thread that for you is meaningful to try and find, because your books are really populated actually with all kinds of people in fairly irreverent and open-ended ways. You don't shy away from also being irreverent as well. And so maybe, I don't want to put my interpretation in, but I can maybe ask you how you deal with such a contested ethno-nationalist history, and where do you find the ways to navigate through that?
So, Kuweni's curse, we hear this a lot. Kuweni, the ancient queen of Sri Lanka, mistreated by a Prince Vijaya from North India. So it's the North Indians to blame for this. Yes. It came down from Delhi.
As I said, dark and Dravidian way here.
So, I won't go into I think it's in the book, but the whole mythology of a lion father and lion mother and all of that. But the thing is, so we have this origin myth, and so the prince betrays Kuweni, who throws herself off the rock. And the thing is, we don't self-identify with the indigenous, with the Kuweni. We've demonized them, calling them the Naga people, the snake people, the demons. And Ravana, who was, the 10-headed villain of the Ramayana, was a Sri Lankan. And I think I've seen a few. Again, it's the hip-hop guys who are claiming Ravana back as a Sri Lankan icon and all of that. But that is seen as our origin story. And we're said, okay, that's why the country goes through economic collapse. That's why our fast bowlers get injuries. It's Kuweni's curse. This is all Kuweni's curse. And that's... but also the reality is, despite this North Indian connection, you go to Kerala, you see the food there. It's appam, indiappam, and the language is very similar, but we don't have this document, even though that's plainly evident. So you know that there are gaps in these histories. And And I think the bit you're referring to is where he refutes the idea of Kueni's curse and looks at the makeup of the flag and the lions and tigers, yeah. And you're right, the dead leopard is the true hero of the book. I'll give you, in my opinion, you'll meet her. I think it is a she, yeah. And yeah, again, no spoilers. But again, I was also struck with where were lions? And I've asked Dr. Anjali Watson, were there ever lions on this place? And she goes, yeah, during, few million years ago. I mean, that's an easy answer, yeah. I wasn't there. So, but basically we have this iconography which is based on a fairly Brothers Grimm-esque, very strange fairy tales with dubious morals in them and don't really kind of square up with the reality. And I figure, yeah, you can make fun of it's not too soon, it's 2,000 years ago, you can make fun of that stuff, or just question it. And also, it's not me making fun of it, so let's not conflate. It's Maali Almeida. He was a loose cannon, and he didn't know what he was doing. And I would never approve that kind of irreverence, but that dude did that. But yeah, there are gaps in our histories, and I think that's where the storytellers are coming in. I've seen a lot of great graphic novelists, even on theater, we're seeing that happening, and I think maybe that's one use that fiction writers can be useful, because we're fairly useless at the rest of it, at documenting history accurately. But
so you document the bureaucracy that the British left us, and now the bureaucracy even after death.
After death, yes.
We're shuffling files and lining up in queues, all very politely to some extent. But let me open the floor now. I'm sure there are questions. So I think there's a question over there. There's some questions over there. So maybe, I think somebody with a mic will come to you.
Hi.
Hi.
Shehan, thank you for writing an amazing novel, very similar to George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo. These ghosts were hilarious, but really what we related to was the humanity. So thank you, that was amazing. I wanted to ask a question about voice. So last year when we were here, Abraham Verghese said how he auditioned to narrate his own novel. And it was extremely important for him to do that. And I listened to Seven Moons. I didn't read it on the page. And I actually thought the actor who was the narrator captured the voice, but I hadn't heard you in person. I only heard his voice. So I was just wondering, what did you think? Did you audition different narrators? Were you happy with the way? Have you listened to the audiobook?
Yeah, great question. Shivanta Vijay Singh, very talented young man. He did both Chinaman and Seven Moons. And he's an actor, he's playing a scene with Liam Neeson now. But the main thing was this, we auditioned voices. It had to be a Sri Lankan voice because otherwise you're going to be mangling all the names. Even if you're Indian or Pakistani, you're going to mangle the names and that's going to lose it. But also the fact that he was an actor meant he could do the different registers of voice and even played the old man in Chinaman. So yeah, and also, yeah, there was for 5 minutes the idea that I would read it, but I rewrote this book 7 times. I wasn't going to reread it again. It's so, and leave it to the professionals. But Lincoln in the Bardo is also, I remember 2017 when it came out and won prizes. I was in the midst of this mess that ended up as Seven Moons and was completely demoralized that a talking ghost book had now conquered the world, so there's no room for 2. But of course, then I read it and I was more than inspired by it, and it's very different to what I was trying to do. But I wonder about that audiobook, which I haven't heard, because that would be lots of different voices, and there's no, I think it's all unattributed dialogue. That would be interesting. But yeah, so ended up getting inspired by it, not demoralized. But yeah, I think Shivanta did a fantastic job. Yeah.
Thank you for being such a brilliant writer. I too am an audiobook listener, and I did listen to yours, and it was very well done. But just a little tip, it makes a huge difference when the writer reads it. And I have a friend who will not read an audiobook unless the writer has read it, because she feels that the person narrating it may not emphasize the thoughts, ideas that the writer has written. So maybe someday you'll do that.
Okay.
But my question had to do with something else. The first Sri Lankan born writer we ever read or heard about was Michael Odanji. And I was wondering, what do Sri Lankan people think of him, and whether you consider him as part of the Sri Lankan writing, because of course he's been in Canada and his voice is not what we are talking about today.
No, so Michael Ondaatje is very much the godfather, the OG of Sri Lankan writing, and because you can, when he won, for the English Patient won the Booker, he set up the Gratian Prize, the Gratian Trust in Sri Lanka, which is for original fiction, plays in English language. And really that's what inspired, when you look at the richness of Sri Lankan writing now, you can draw a direct line, because I think the first winner was Carl Muller's Jam Fruit Tree. And then as young writers, this is what we would submit it to it. And he's always been a patron. And yeah, when Chinaman came out, I met him at Barefoot Cafe, and he's always been a very positive influence. But so yeah, I think he's certainly considered a Sri Lankan writer, and I think he identifies as a Canadian Sri Lankan writer, but he writes about Sri Lanka. The one I would like to claim though as a Sri Lankan writer is Sir Arthur C. Clarke, who lived a bit of a divisive, controversial figure, but has lived in Sri Lanka longer than I've been alive, and sat there. And it still blows my mind that he didn't like flying, and he just loved Sri Lanka, went diving and wrote his wonderful books. So Stanley Kubrick came to Colombo, and they sat in Buller's Lane in a cafe discussing 2001. And so that, for me, I was like, yeah, Colombo 7, if someone discussed the beginning of humanity to the end of the stars, if that could be written in Sri Lanka, there's hope. So that's what I'm claiming Sir Arthur for us, and yeah, Michael as well. I think, Sri Lankan writing is quite an inclusive party, and yeah, everyone's invited, yeah.
And then I think we'll take a question on that, and then we'll take a question on this side of the room as well.
On a lighter note, Murali, of course, is the best bowler ever, I feel. Subjected to some racism by certain countries. What's going on with Sri Lankan cricket from your perspective?
I haven't got that question in a long time. Since Chinaman, that was the question every time. Does Sangha and Mahela, do they get on or not? There's my friend Andrew Fidel Fernando, writes for Crick Info. And, wonderful job he does, brilliant writer. And he goes around the world watching Sri Lanka lose and somehow mines some sort of humor or philosophy from it. But yeah, every time we lose really badly, and now we're sort of on a high because we've had a few victories in test matches, he wheels out the same article about, the way the cricket board is structured, and the fact that we've produced talent despite the system. There's with the 96 World Cup was a bunch of amateurs, bank clerks, insurance salesmen who managed to win, and then money came into it. And we produced these Muralis, Malingas, despite the system. And this idea that we don't need to fix anything, we got the talent, I feel that and we have that, hopefully again this has changed, but this idea with our political system as well. Someone's gonna come and hit a 6 in the last ball and everything. We don't need a proper system change, we got by on our plucky island talent, and so I see the parallels there. What's happening now, none of Andrew's points have still been addressed. Maybe I've seen a few moves about cleaning up the sports sector, so maybe that can. But we've got the talent. Yeah. So
T20, yes or no?
T20. No, I'm old school.
I hate the T20.
Yeah, but doesn't matter what we think. It's
money.
It tried to conquer America last year, right?
Yes, that's right.
Did it succeed, or maybe slow? I've tried watching baseball, though. I think cricket needs to conquer America. Come on, those games are so long, and you can't bounce the ball, and you got a glove. Yeah, no. Sorry.
We have a question over there.
Hey, Shehan. Glad to hear you're also a fan of Test cricket. Yes. But I have a question to you about your approach to the craft of writing. Now, Chinaman is one of my all-time favorite novels. But it felt to me like Chinaman versus Maali, they had slightly different audiences in mind. I don't know if that was intentional or maybe that's just me. Chinaman felt very rooted and like as written for a fellow South Asian reader, while Maali felt a little more like it was attuned to the sensibilities of a Western reader who might have different expectations for a South Asian novel. I don't know if that was intentional, but also, the bigger question there is, do you think about those types of things when you write? Are you more of the planner who writes out every chapter and knows exactly who you're writing for, what type of tone you want to adopt, and then you stick to it throughout the novel? Or are you more of a spontaneous writer, right? And do you kind of see what evolves on the page and then assemble that together into a story, into a novel?
The planner, the architect versus the gardener, yeah. I'm very much a gardener. I do the architecture, but it gets abandoned pretty quickly, and I do sort of, yeah. I know just 2 chapters ahead. I'll know 2 chapters ahead what's happening just as much, and then, so I didn't know, for instance, if Pradeep Mathew would be found at the end. I didn't know who killed Maali at the end, and when you're writing, you're not thinking. It may be different with the next one, let's see. But with these 2, I wasn't thinking what is a publisher in London or a producer in Hollywood going to think of this. I was thinking, does it play to... And I guess with Chinaman, I was thinking of someone who'd followed Sri Lankan cricket, like one of those annoying uncles who knows every stat and is going to call me out if I get things wrong. So I was thinking of that person. And then the next edit, though, Chiki Sarka at Random House, was for, I guess, more of a South Asian audience. She shaved about 150 pages off it, and I think it's a much better book for it. But this one went through the same evolution. Chats with the Dead came out in India just before COVID, and again, it struggled to get any interest outside of, in the UK and the US. And so it was, but I think when you're writing the first few drafts and finding the story yourself, you don't think of anyone other than, because then you talk about a kottu roti, you have to explain what that is, and then you're suddenly writing travel writing. And so I do it that way, but then when the edit comes, Natanya Jans of Sort of Books said, I think it's a terrific idea, but this is going to be really tough for a Western reader who doesn't remember your war, doesn't know what a left-arm spinner is and all of that. So, and I didn't take it as a sellout, really. I think, I'm an ad guy, so selling out is not a problem for me. I'm trying to write detective fiction. And the thing, what you asked about South Asian writing as well, that's also marketing, because when I had Chats with the Dead, Natanya and Mark said, we got to change the title. And I said, why? It's a murder mystery, Chats with the Dead. She goes, no, it's going to go in the next to Lee Child and Michael Connelly, it's going to sink. Why don't we call it the 7 Moons of Maali Almeida? And I said, that's just such a patronizing Orientalist, exotic Sri Lanka kind of name. And they said, yeah, exactly. Yeah. We can sell that. It'll sit next to Arundhati Roy on the shelf. It'll get nominated for some prizes, maybe. And so it is marketing as well, but I'm aware of it. So I think, Chats with the Dead and 7 Moons aren't different books. They're the same book, but I think Richard Simon, a critic from Sri Lanka, said it uses the same words to tell slightly different stories. But I don't mind now, I think with Chinaman, if you know nothing about cricket, by page 50, you know what a ball and a bat and a leg spin is and all of that. So I think, obviously you want to be accessible to as many people as possible. So, but that happens at the editing stage, and I'm currently editing my short stories for the same reason. So, yeah.
So I think we just have time for one more question. So we have a question here in the back, and then.
Sure.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting to hear the comment about the audience and exoticizing South Asians, and it's really funny, but I see a through trend. After Isabel Allende wrote House of Spirits, we've had Mistress of Spices, we've had so many in the same vein. And how do you keep yourself from watching out for those very easy temptations to indulge in that sort of exoticism of some kind?
Who knows? I mean, I also live in the swamp itself. I'm not looking from outside. So I can see the frangipani flowers. I can also see the uncollected garbage. And I see the peacocks and the crows as well. So, yeah, I don't, but I suppose it's an easy trap to fall into. But I think the professional writers, we write every single day, and when the thing starts evolving and talking back to you, especially if you're living there and you're smelling the air and hearing the rhythms of speech, I think that stuff gets weeded out, and you still, you can still talk about the spices and all of that, but also talk about the uncollected garbage, because there's probably a more interesting story there. So, but yeah, you are mindful for it. But I think, yeah, everyone's also now, writers also hyper aware of these cliches as well. So, but it's easy trap to fall into. So, let's not be too harsh on anyone who uses those. Yeah.
Well, I think on that note, I want to end by saying that I thought that you did a really interesting job in depicting my mother. And I did think that maybe I could perfectly imagine her in the afterlife being a very harassed woman, trying to organize people and trying to put them in some order. So I really enjoyed I enjoyed the way that you talked about her, actually.
Thank you. That was the most moving tribute, really. We should applaud that one, because...
and I think you can see from this audience here that your writing is a very profound gift to us all, and as you say, Sri Lankan writing is having a moment. I encourage you all to read some of the amazing fiction, poetry, non-fiction, coming from out of the island, also from elsewhere about the island. And thank you again also for what you have done and what you are continuing to do. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you.